Hi, I'm Shannon from houseimprovements.com. In today's video, I'm going to show you some information on table saws. So I've got a couple of examples here just in the shop. I've got my stationary larger saw here that I use, all the time. And then I've got this one that I've made a little bit more portable for moving around in the shop, or if I want to run it outside to cut something or whatever, or I just want to have two saws set up with different blades in. So we'll just look at this one for right now, just because it's easier to look at. With the table saw, they've all kind of got the same basic parts. You're going to have some type of a cabinet with the saw itself in it and a top. The tops are going to vary in size. It's usually going to be on a stand, and in this case I've added a mobile base to the bottom so it easily moves around, but yet if I get it to where I want, I can kick it down so it sits stable without rolling around while I'm using it. So it's handy, especially if you don't have a big enough space to have a dedicated spot for your saw just to sit. This way you can roll it away out of the way. So you're going to have also a rip fence like this that goes on here, and it'll run on some rails of some kind that are mounted to the saw top. You can see in this instance, my rip fence is longer, as well as my rails are longer as well. So on this saw here, I think I have a maximum cut of almost 2 feet. It's not even quite 2 feet. This saw, I've got a maximum cut of like 53 inches. So this is a lot nicer if you're cutting a lot of plywoods and that sort of thing. It's just a little more functional for that. But there's absolutely lots of use in a saw this size. Even for plywood, you'll figure it out and work around whatever problems you have because of the size of the top. But if you have the space, I would definitely go bigger. They can be constructed in a bunch of different things. Most shop saws like this, the good ones, will have a good cast iron surface for the main part of the saw. So this gives it some good weight to it, and it tells you a little bit about the overall quality of the saw as well. There's a lot of portable saws that are plastics and I'm not even sure, some other kind of products that just help make the saws lighter so they're easier to move around. My portable saw that I keep in my trailer for on site is all plastic. So it's not that it's not all plastic. The top is, I don't even know, it might be aluminum. I'm not even sure. It's not that it's a lower quality saw, it's just made a little lighter so it's more portable. So you're going to have that. You're going to have some type of a switch. Always make sure your saw is unplugged or breakers off when you're doing any adjustments or anything, but you're going to have some kind of on-off switch. This one here is kind of a simple rocker where you can pull it on and you can bump it with your knee in emergency if you had to, or your hip or whatever, to turn it off. I prefer my switches over here. Just, I find it easier to get to, but this one just happens to be on this side. All saws are going to come with a blade guard and a riving knife and the anti-kickback things. A lot of times you won't see this product on the saws anymore, but personally, my own feeling on this setup is that the blade guard itself is actually really, it's unsafe in my mind. Once this clear plastic get used a bit and you've got sawdust on it, it's hard to see the blade anyways, hard to judge as easily through it what's going on at the blade, as opposed to that being off and seeing the blade. But I'm not telling you not to use your saw without the safety equipment, but I'm just saying my preference. This piece here, this flat piece, what this does is as you're pushing material through, it helps keep the two sides of the material apart so they're not binding on the blade. I actually don't have this on my other saw because of another attachment I use at times. I can't put this on anymore, but this is a good idea to keep this part on. And these as well. These keep from, if the wood does bind and get jammed up and the blade wants to kick it out, these actually spring down against it and help clamp it down so you don't get a kickback. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But all saws will come with some type of a guard and a kickback system on them. A lot of the saws will be like this with the motor mounted on the back, on the outside of the cabinet. Motor size that'll all vary depending on the saw. A lot of these motors can be wired for either 240 volt or 120 volt, simply by changing some of the wiring inside here. So that's an option on quite a few of them, especially cabinet type shops or saws. This one is a belt drive with the motor on the outside. Some of them actually have a direct drive, so the motor is inside of this cabinet and the blade itself is mounted directly on the end of the shaft. My saw in my trailer is that way. The motor is mounted right inside. So that's that. You can see here on a better fence setup, this back of the fence here, when it's locked in place, is also going to lock into something on the back to make it more rigid here. On the cheaper setups, this wouldn't lock in, but the problem with that is you can get a little bit of flex in the fence sometimes, so it doesn't stay as true. So you're better off if it locks front and back. What else can I talk about before we go into some demonstrations? I'll try to get this turned around here. So down below, actually I'm going to take this guard off so we can see the blade. This one comes off pretty easily. So I'm just going to move that out of the way. So you've got some adjustments you can do on, I think, all table saws. You should be able to move the blade up or down, and you should be able to tilt the blade at least one direction. So if you wanted to do a bevel cut or something like that. And the controls for that on most all table saws are down below on the cabinet, and generally on the front of the cabinet and one side or the other, you're going to have a wheel handle like this. And generally the front one is the one that will raise and lower the blade, and there might be a locking mechanism, there might not be. This one doesn't have that. So you can see by simply turning this knob or this dial one way or another, it's either raising or lowering the blade. The one that'll be mounted over on the side is one that adjusts the actual angle of the blade. So now we can make the blade tilt one way or the other. So you can simply go around to the side and grab the wheel and turn it, which in turn will, you can see here there's a small gauge, I think you can see that, and it's running along on this miter degree gauge here. And you can see as I turn the wheel on the side, the adjustment, the degrees here are marking different, and the blade itself is actually tilting as well. So pretty much, I think all table saws will go to at least 45 degrees. If you're doing fine cabinetry or very specific angles, I wouldn't trust this gauge 100%. I wouldn't even honestly trust it most times to be at 90 degrees straight up and down, even though the gauge says that. If you need it to be, the blade to actually be perfectly square to the tabletop or at a certain angle, I would use, for square you can simply use a square on the tabletop and against the blade. Just raise the blade all the way up. And again, I'm doing all this with the saw unplugged, so there's no chance of it coming on. So to check for perfectly straight 90 degree cut, you simply use a square right on the table of the saw, butt it over the blade. You can see right there possibly that there's a slight gap at the top. Okay, maybe you can't. Cameraman says you can't quite pick that up on there. Actually, I'll make it more obvious. Which way is it? This. So let's just say the gauge actually said 90. You put this on there, you can see it's tight down here, but it isn't at the top. So regardless of what this gauge down here says, obviously just tilt the blade until it is tight with your square, and then you know you are at 90 degrees for sure. And I think on most of these there is some adjustment, but I still wouldn't trust it. Even if you adjusted it, it might be wrong next time you use it. When you're testing something like this, most saw blades, the tooth of the saw is wider than the actual body of the blade. So when you're putting a square up against there, you don't want to be against the tooth because it's obviously going to hold you away from the blade, but you want to be between the teeth where you can be right against the body of the blade. It's your truest way of doing that. Now, I don't have one on me, but when you're doing angles, there's actually a magnetic angle finder that'll stick right on this blade. It's digital. Tilt your blade till it digitally tells you what your angle is. You have to zero it out to 90 so that it knows what 90 is when you first use it. Stick it on there, tilt your blade till you get the angle you want. And I wish I had one to show you. I just don't. So you can, that's more trustworthy than that gauge down there. So that covers that. Something I didn't talk about, and I'm not sure, maybe I'll show it on the other saw, is there's usually a tape on here so that when you're moving your fence, you can line it up and actually know what you've got for a distance between your blade. I don't always trust it. If I've got to be perfect, I always measure it anyways, but I'll show you on the other saw because it's easier to read. So I'm just going to roll this saw out of the way. I think that's all I can show you on this one. We'll just get it out of the way, and we'll reset the camera over by my bigger saw, and we'll do some demos on cutting with it. Okay, we've moved over to the larger saw that's permanently affixed in my shop here. And I just want to show you a couple more things, and basically the two main cuts that most people are going to want to do with their table saw. So the two basic type of cuts that you can do with a table saw is ripping some wood or lumber, which is basically running the length of the material through the saw between the fence that it has and the blade. I'm just going to put the blade up here a bit. Something that's worth mentioning, there's a lot of discussion on how tall should my blade be protruding above what I'm cutting. Obviously, the further it sticks up, the more dangerous it is. So we want to avoid, if I'm cutting this plywood that's 3/4 of an inch, I don't need to have my blade up 9 times out of 10. I don't need it that high. There's just more chance of me getting into it. And you notice I'm not wearing any jewelry, no long sleeves, no gloves. You don't want anything like that, loose clothing, anything around a spinning blade, obviously. So it's getting back to the height of the blade. There are instances where I would have the blade this high, only because if I'm making a really exact cut where I need to get into an inside corner or something, I can get closer if I have the blade this high. You can see the angle of the teeth on that wood is, if I make a mark on this wood. So when I have the blade really high up, my edge of my blade is cutting on that type of angle. If I've got it down where it's safer to be, oops, grabbing the wrong knob here. If I have it down, which usually I try to be about 1/4 inch above my material, or just to the bottom of the teeth above the material. So in normal cutting operation, I would be that high. But when I'm that high, you can see that my blade's cutting on a way less angle than it is when it's all the way up. So if I needed my cut to be coming, if I was cutting a corner out here, I can get a lot closer to this corner with the blade standing high on the top than I can with it right down. The top would only be cut to here. So sometimes you will want to have the blade way up, but safest for everyday cutting when you're cutting right through material is approximately 1/4 inch above your material surface. Okay, so this is ripping material. To cross-cut material, this would be where you're maybe wanting to cut this to length or cut a bunch of other pieces off of this board, and you're going to use a T-bevel guide, which fits into these slots on the surface of the table saw. And then I can push my material through here. This helps stabilize the material and helps me hang on to it, prevents kickbacks, and this can also be changed and rotated to different angles. Oops. So if I want to cut 20-degree angle on here, I can. Okay, I'm going to show ripping first. So I'm just, oops. Let's get this guide out of the way. So with ripping, it's usually a case of you're trying to rip something to width and you're setting this fence, the distance from this fence to the inside of the blade here to the size that you want is generally what you'd be doing. Most saws will be set up with this tape measure on here, like I had mentioned just a minute ago, as a guide for that distance between the blade and the fence. So you'll have a measuring tape usually on one of the rails, and you're going to have some kind of a pointer or something on the fence itself that lines up with these measurements. Now, all saws have some adjustments, so if that gets off, you can adjust it, fine tune it. If you need that to be perfect, you know, let's just say you want to be exactly 10 inches, I'd normally move my saw over, set it on what this says is 10, and then I would take out my tape measure and actually measure between the fence and the widest inside part of the tooth on the blade and adjust my fence accordingly. Some fences, when you slide them in position and lock it, they will actually kind of move a little bit when you're doing the locking setup. So it's always a good idea, if you need to be exact, that you measure it specifically using a tape measure instead of just trusting this all the time. So for rip cuts, you will set your fence and you will push your material through. When you're pushing it through, you're keeping your hands obviously away from here, and you're pushing, generally pushing only on the material that's passing between the fence and the blade. And you want to be pushing forward as well as pushing over against the fence. So when I set up to do this, I would start the saw, I get my material against the fence, and I'm using this hand back here. As long as this hand is behind the blade, on my side of the blade, it's safe. And I'm pushing against there just a little bit to keep it tight to the blade, and I'm using my other hand to push through. Now as I get up to here, let's just say the blade was almost through the wood, I don't want to have my hands up here where the blade is, because now I'm actually pinching the blade with that loose piece that's there. This extra guide hand is always behind the blade. Once you get down to, I would say, you know, 4 to 6 inches of what you're trying to cut in here, this space, then you want to be using some type of a push stick as pushing it through. And what this does is it will hook on your material, and it's used instead of your hand down here. So it just is getting your hand and your fingers up away from the blade. So as I come through here, my hand's way up here now, away from the blade, instead of down here. When I'm cutting something, let's say that's 6 inches, and I'm using, in my case, I'd be using my hand. You could still use the push stick if you're more comfortable with that. But when I'm down into this range, I kind of have one of my fingers on my fence anyways. I can hook my finger here. I've got my thumb, I'm using it on the back side of the wood here, and these 3 fingers holding the wood down. And I'm pushing the wood through here, but I'm kind of hooking this finger here to keep my hand from, for whatever reason, falling in. So that's just how I've learned and what I do all the time. And most people are, you'll see them, they're guiding their hand across the top of the fence. But rule of thumb for most people would be, if you get less than 6 inches in here, you want to be using a push stick anyways. I mean, obviously, if I'm pushing something that's 2 feet wide through here, I'm going to have both hands on this part, making sure this hand, though, isn't getting too close to the blade. Okay? As you use a table saw, you'll get more comfortable, but never get comfortable enough that you're getting your hand too close to that blade. That is gonna hurt you. You see a lot of older carpenters, and not even older, you'll see a lot of carpenters and they're missing part of a finger, and it's usually because of a table saw. So let's actually make a cut, and then you can kind of see me pushing it through the saw. You can see here on this saw has also got an extra safety feature of a pin through the start blade. So if you didn't have it unplugged, you could at least have that in. I would still recommend you unplug it though if you're doing anything with the blade, changing the blade or touching the blade. Okay, so we'll reposition the saw so you can see a little better. and I'll do one rip cut. Okay, so basic rip cut again. You're going to set your fence to what you want, lock it in, make sure it's good and solid. Safety gear, you're going to probably want some earplugs, you're going to want safety glasses for sure, and remember, no long sleeves, gloves, rings, those sorts of things. Okay, my dust collector is on this switch, so I'm going to turn it on, then I'll turn my saw on, and I'll make this cut. Something else to mention is having an outfeed table really helps, especially for long materials, so that as you get through here, the end of the material is on the table or rolling extension or whatever you have, and you aren't trying to keep it from falling on the floor, which may end up with your arm in the saw. So, okay. So some of the steps you see me do there, I had my full board. I'm using this hand as a guide against the fence, this hand as a guide to push through the blade. As I started in, I'm still guiding with this hand, but you noticed it stayed well back of the blade. I was using this hand itself until I got well up onto the table saw table. Then I switched to my push stick. What you don't want to do ever is be partway into a cut and take your hands off the wood. Because a lot of times what's going to happen is this blade is spinning. I'm going to raise it up just so it's easier for you to see. This blade is spinning this direction. Okay, so it's pushing down on this edge of the material, down to the table generally. But what's happening is as it comes up on the back side, if this wood twists, it wants to grab the back side of the wood and force it up, which usually forces it out. And for most of us, that's in a really no-go zone. So it's going to hit you where you don't want to be hit, or it's going to flip right up, get you in the face, those sorts of things. So by always at least having a hand on your material, you know, you're reaching over to get something, I'm always making sure I have a hand on there. Keep this from kicking back. Okay, so I went to the push stick, and I continued to push through. Once I got to here, I'm assuming this hand went away. I don't know, I don't even think about it anyway. Usually this hand's moved out of the situation, and I finished pushing right through. This would have been going with it. Then I got to this point. This piece is free. I made sure it's well out of the blade. This piece will have stopped just behind the blade, right? Because it's not attached anymore. I'm just kind of reaching over with my push stick, not with my hand, because I don't want my arm to get anywhere close to there. I just gave that a little kick to make sure it got away from the blade. Okay. If this, for whatever reason, ended up back here, it shouldn't really, but if it does, you don't want to go in here with your hand here and try to grab it to get it out of the way, because you may bump it against the blade that's still spinning, and you've got the same kind of problem. This might have went free, this piece comes up, and the next thing you know, you're eating it. Okay, so you just have to be aware of everything that's going on and the possibility of wood coming back at you. And this is a scary thought, I understand. If you haven't really used a table saw much, or even if you've used it a lot, you've seen these things. Everybody still has to be safe about what they're doing. And some of us get complacent at times because we do it so much, and it only takes one of those kickbacks to remind you that, oh yeah, I need to keep my hand on that. So with a push stick too, sometimes you're cutting, maybe you're only cutting a ½ inch off of that, right? You can see this push stick, it's sacrificial. So it all used to be this wide here, and you can see, you know, I've used it. As my wood goes through, the blade has contacted it and ripped some of it down. But that's what this is for. That is to make sure that isn't your finger being touched by the blade. And you can make push sticks. We're probably going to do some videos showing how to make a push stick, so you can have a look and see if it's up yet. Just trying to think if there's anything else to mention with this blade. Or with this fence, I mean. Most of the fences are all going to have adjustments here to make sure the fence is running true to the blade. Some people make the mistake of thinking that the blade is going to be true exactly to these guides that are in the top, and that isn't always true. So some people think that, and then they just adjust their fence to make sure it's straight in line with one of those. But when you do that, it may actually not be in line with the blade. You want your fence to be completely in line with the blade, and if anything, the back side of the fence just open like a 30-second more away from the blade. This will help to prevent it from pinching, but you don't want it any more than that because it throws off your cut. Okay, so my point was that most of the fences will have some kind of adjustment to true your fence to the blade. Okay, I think that's enough about ripping. Actually, no, it isn't. There's lots of other attachments you can get for your saws, feather blades, those sorts of things. So if you're not wanting to have your other hand here, sometimes you can put a feather blade or feather board in here. So what that's doing is acting like that hand. It's keeping the wood against your fence. This one happens to be magnetic, but there's other types that will fit into these guides on the saw, those sorts of things. So there's other accessories you can have with your saw. Most important one is a push stick, in my opinion. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, so it'd be this T-bevel guide that we talked briefly about before in there. I'm going to show you how to make cuts with this now. Now with this guide, again, it's important that it's squared to the blade, not squared to the table. I've seen a lot of people stick it in here and line it up with just the edge of the table to square it up, but you actually want it square to this blade. So that's simple enough, obviously, with a square against here, slide it over the blade, adjust this until it's tight on the blade, okay? I don't think I need to go into too much detail with that. So again, make sure this is square to the blade. Then you can, if you're going to use this on angles and stuff, again, I would use something that's at the proper angle as a guide and not necessarily trust these if you need to be dead on accurate. Okay, so square it up to the blade, you're good to go. What most people will do as well is add a sacrificial or a little bit longer fence to this, because if you've got a really long piece of wood and you're trying to go through and cut, you know, this is kind of wobbly because you don't really have much support out here. You're relying on this, whatever this is, 6-7 inches here for support. So a lot of times we will add a piece of wood or scrap or whatever onto here to give us some more length to our guide. So this guide is for cross cutting, as I mentioned. I'm just going to screw this on here. Most of these guides all have some kind of accessory holes or whatever so that you can add something on here. So it's used for cross cutting. You don't want to use both these fences or these guides in conjunction with each other, because it's pretty tempting to say, well, I want to cut a whole bunch of 5-inch, 7-inch pieces, let's say. So you think, okay, well, I'm going to use this fence as my measurement guide, so every piece is the same. I'm going to slide that over to there, and I'm going to push through here now. What happens, though, is you're going to get yourself into trouble, because as you get cutting through here, and this piece breaks free from here, it wants to start to twist in there, or it can want to, which is going to create a kickback. So it's dangerous in the fact that that piece might come out of there. It's dangerous in the fact that you might physically react to that, seeing that happening, and go to grab it and get your hand in a bad spot, cut your hand. So don't use the two together. If you want to do something like that, what you actually want to do is use, what do I got here? Let's just use this for a spacer. I would do this. If I want to do 7 inches, I would set up something against this fence. So it's at the 7 inches. I can slide my material over to use that as a stop. Now I hold this to there and I pull that out. So now when I go through here, when this comes free, it has the room to turn and it can sit over here safely between the blade and the fence because we've created this space. Okay, so that's much safer than using the fence alone. Okay, so just use something as a spacer there. And make sure your spacer is big enough. Don't just stick a little piece of 1/2-inch plywood against there, because that may not give you the room, especially on a wider piece like that. If it moved at all, it might still bind. So use something, you know, 4 or 5 inches wide. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. You can also be just measuring your piece and, you know, when the blade's off, lining up to the blade, or have the end of this stock that you put on there right equal to the end of the blade so you know that that's where it is as a guide. Blade height, it's all going to be the same. I think that's all I can really say there. So to make a cut here, basically you just mark whatever you want marked. So I know I've got my guide cut right against the fence. So if I wanted a 3-inch piece, I need 3 inches plus the thickness of my blade, because this blade is going to cut outside of my, if I'm saving this piece, so I can go 3 1/8, because my blade's an 1/8 inch, line it up with the end of my wood here, cut it through. The piece that comes out should be 3 inches. Okay. If you're cutting this piece, it's basically the same idea. You just don't need to add the extra 1/8 of an inch. So I'll run a piece through there just so you can see the process. Again, you need all the same safety gear and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so you can kind of follow through the steps that I did there. I had my piece, I pushed it through, this piece came off just to the side here, this piece was still on the fence. But you noticed one thing, I didn't immediately just slip this back, you know, to get ready for another cut while the blade was still spinning, because all it takes is this to have slid out a little bit, catches on the blade, and again you've got a problem because it catches on that back side of that spinning blade. So I purposely left this jig all by itself over there till I turned the saw off and the blade stopped turning. I moved this because I've got free range over here. I'm comfortable with having my hand here, getting rid of this. I could have taken my push stick, moved that out of the way as well. I got this access piece off. Meanwhile, my blade is stopped. I can pull this back now safely and set up for the next cut. The other option, if you don't have anything blocking it, is I could have pushed this right through the saw and brought it through that way. But I think that pretty much covers it. Obviously, we talked at this angles, the blade tilts, all that kind of stuff. So I think we got the basics on using a table saw pretty much covered there, and some of the safety as well. Okay, so again, a little longer video. If you've watched me before, you're quite used to that, but I think we also gave you lots of detail that you may not find in other people's videos. So hopefully you did, and if you did and you liked the video, click the little thumbs up for us down below. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Share our channel. If you have any questions about this, you're better off not to put it in the comments. Actually come over to the forum and ask your question, and I can give you a more direct answer there. I don't necessarily check the comments real often below the video, so you're better off to post a comment, or not a comment, a question in the forum. Okay, like always, click like and subscribe. Check out our Patreon link in below, and we'll throw on probably some Amazon affiliate links in the description below for table saws and accessories. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.